I almost missed it. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this story. They think I was standing there, camera ready, some pilgrim who'd made the journey specifically for this. But I wasn't. I was eating a sausage roll from a paper bag and arguing with myself about whether to take the tube back or walk, and the whole city was doing what London does in October, going gray and damp and completely indifferent to whether you're having a good day or not. That's how it started. Me, a sausage roll, the smell of rain on old stone. And then something happened to time. I'd been in London for 4 days at that point. Not a tourist, not exactly, more like someone who'd been unmoored from his regular life and had floated by a combination of cheap flights and a friend's empty flat in Pimlico to a city that didn't know his name. I'd needed that. The anonymity. The specific pleasure of walking streets where no one expected anything from you. The flat belonged to Darren, who was doing something in Singapore for 3 months and had sent me a key through the post with a note that said, "Don't let the neighbors see you leave before 9 a.m. They'll think I've sublet." So every morning, I slid out of the building with a furtiveness that made me feel like I was 19 again and leaving a girl's house before her parents woke up. London was helping me feel young, or at least less old. That morning, I'd walked from Pimlico all the way up through St. James's Park without any real destination, just moving. The park was what it always is in October, something between beautiful and exhausted, like a sentence that started strong and then trailed off. The leaves were doing their performance. The pelicans on the lake were doing their thing of looking prehistoric and vaguely offended by human existence. A man was playing a saxophone badly near the bandstand, and a group of school children were pretending not to find it funny. I came out on the mall side, the long avenue, the flags. And here's where I need to explain something about the mall, because if you haven't stood on it, really stood on it, not just passed through on your way somewhere else, you might not understand what it does to a person. It's not just a road. It's a stage. Everything about it was designed to make you feel like you're inside a sentence that hasn't finished yet. The plane trees on either side, the reddish gravel surface, the way Buckingham Palace sits at the end of it like a thought you've been building toward all your life. You don't stand on the mall and feel small exactly. You feel held, like the city has put its hands around you and is presenting you to something larger than itself. I stood there eating my sausage roll and not going anywhere. There were maybe 40 people around, tourists from several continents, identifiable by their lanyards and their expressions of careful wonder. A few joggers, a couple walking a dog the size of a small country. The October air tasted like it was deciding whether to rain and hadn't committed yet. I checked my phone. 11:43. Nothing was scheduled to happen. I knew that. I'd looked the way you do when you're in London and you're half hoping you'll stumble into something ceremonial by accident. There was no parade on the official calendar. No state visit listed. No changing of the guard at an unusual time. Which is why, when I heard it, I thought I was wrong about what I was hearing. A sound, low and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the palace. Not drums. Not quite. More like pressure, like the air itself was clearing its throat. The tourists heard it before they understood it, which is how you know something is real. Their bodies responded while their brains were still catching up. A collective tightening, a turning of heads, the way a field of grass all bends in the same direction when the wind decides. The dog went still. That was the thing I remember most clearly. It had been pulling on its lead, that big absurd creature, going about its dog business of needing to be everywhere at once, and then it simply stopped, stood straight, ears forward. Animals, I thought. Animals always know. The sound was getting clearer, organized. Hooves, but not the casual clop of the tourist horses that drift through the park in the afternoons. This was something structured, a beat with intention behind it. And then the outriders came around the curve. They materialize the way things in dreams materialize, not from a specific point of origin, but simply into being. 4 of them, 2 pairs, on horses so black they made the gray October sky look warm by comparison. The riders wore the dark blue of the household cavalry, their brass buttons catching a light that the sky wasn't actually providing, which was the first moment my brain registered something slightly off. Where was that gleam coming from? The sun was behind cloud. Had been all morning. I filed it. Kept watching. The outrider's posture was not human in any way I'd been prepared for. Every civilian standing there, including me, including the joggers who'd stopped mid-stride, we all had our weight distributed the way people distribute weight when they're watching something. Shifted to one hip. Head tilted. A slight forward lean of curiosity. Those riders had no weight at all. Or rather, their weight was so perfectly placed, so wholly committed to verticality, that watching them made you aware, almost painfully, of your own slovenly relationship with your own skeleton. I straightened without meaning to. So did the woman beside me. We glanced at each other and then looked away, both slightly embarrassed, like we'd been caught doing the same involuntary thing. Then, the carriage came around the curve. I want to be careful here. I want to describe what I actually saw rather than what the word carriage conjures, because those two things are quite different. What you imagine when someone says royal carriage is probably a picture from postcard, gold paint, ornate wheels, something from a Disney film or a history book. Static, decorative. What I saw moving toward me was none of those things. Or rather, it was all of those things but alive. The state landau, which is what I later learned it was called, was open at the top. A landau, two facing seats, folding hood, built for being seen. And it was being seen. Every molecule of it was constructed for the act of being witnessed. And yet the effect was not theatrical in a cheap way. It was ceremonial. There's a difference. Theater performs for you. Ceremony performs alongside you. Ceremony says, you are part of this. Your presence makes this real. The carriage was dark navy blue, not the gold I'd expected, with the royal arms on the door panel. The wheels were painted the same deep red-black as drying blood, and they turned with a sound, not the clatter of old wood and iron you'd imagine, but something smoother, more deliberate, like the mechanism of a very expensive watch. For horses, gray, moving in a cadence so precisely matched you'd have thought they shared one nervous system. 2 footmen on the back step, upright, motionless, each one an argument against the idea that human beings have ever been casual. And inside there was a figure. I couldn't tell you, even now, whether it was a man or a woman. It doesn't matter, and I'm not being coy. It genuinely didn't register as the primary information. What registered was something else, a quality of presence. The figure was dressed in deep green, the kind of green that has dark in it, that remembers being a forest. They sat completely still in the way that very few humans ever manage to sit completely still, not rigid, not tense, but settled, like a stone in a wall that has found its perfect fit and doesn't need to be anything other than what it is. They weren't waving. That's the thing that unsettled me first. Every image of royalty I'd carried in my mind involved the wave, the particular elevated, rotating gesture. But this figure wasn't performing. They were simply there, present in a way that made most of my moments of being present feel like sketches of presence. Rough drafts. The carriage was close now, maybe 30 feet, 20. I didn't take a picture. My phone was in my jacket pocket, and I never once thought about reaching for it. That was odd. I take pictures of everything. I'm that person. The person who photographs food before eating it, who stops to photograph shadows on walls, who interrupted a perfectly good conversation 3 days earlier to photograph a pigeon standing on a bollard in a way that seemed philosophically significant. I didn't photograph this. I just watched. 15 feet. And that was when it happened. Not the figure in the carriage looking at me. I want to be precise. They didn't look at me specifically. But as the carriage drew level, directly level, those 6 or 7 seconds of proximity, I felt something shift in the way I was experiencing duration. Not slow motion. Not what you'd call a movie moment. More like a skip in a record. Like time was playing normally and then it stuttered, not backward, not forward, just gathered itself. Caught on something. Held a frame longer than physics normally allows. I felt my own heartbeat. I felt the cold air move past my face. I heard, very distinctly, the sound of my own swallow. Ridiculous, undignified sound that no one else could have heard over the hooves and the gravel and the low murmur of 40 people holding a collective breath. The carriage passed. and it was over. Except it wasn't. The first thing I noticed afterward was sound. Sound coming back. The way sound comes back into a room after a very large door has been closed. Not flood, but seep. A child somewhere saying mum, mum, mum with the particular cadence of a child who isn't distressed, just checking coordinates. A tourist camera going off. The dog, released from its trance, shaking itself vigorously and then sneezing. The woman beside me said, very quietly, "What was that?" She wasn't asking about the carriage. I knew that, and didn't answer because I didn't have an answer that wasn't embarrassing. The outriders rounded the bend past the Victoria Memorial, and the carriage followed, and then it was simply a sound diminishing, and then nothing. The mall became the mall again. Gravel and plain trees and the particular London grey. A jogger, the one who'd stopped mid-stride, resumed running as if a switch had been flipped, his ponytail swinging, his headphones back in, his body reclaiming its regular forward motion through a regular world. I stood there with a sausage roll going cold in my hand. I looked at my phone. 11:43. The same time. I checked it before the outriders came. It still read 11:43. My rational mind assembled the explanation efficiently. I'd been standing there for less than a minute. The carriage had passed. Fewer than 60 seconds had elapsed. Of course, the time hadn't changed. But that's not what it had felt like. It had felt like something had been inserted. Not into the clock, but into me. I didn't go back to the flat. I meant to. I'd had a vague plan. Tube from St. James's Park. Make some tea. Read the book I'd been using mostly as a prop for looking unbothered in cafes. Instead, I found myself walking. Not toward anything. The kind of walking where your legs are solving a problem your brain hasn't articulated yet. I ended up on Birdcage Walk, which runs along the bottom edge of the park and has the peculiar quality of feeling slightly removed from the city, even while being very much in it. The trees along that stretch are old in a way that registers in your body before your eyes catalog it. Your pace slows. You don't decide to slow. You just do, the way you lower your voice in a library without anyone asking you to. I sat on a bench, put the cold sausage roll on the bench beside me. Thought about 11:43. The sensible version of what happened is simple. Large, impressive things sometimes produce unusual perceptual effects. Awe, the real thing, not the watered-down version we've flattened into a social media adjective, does something measurable to the nervous system. Heart rate changes. Peripheral vision narrows. The brain's time-keeping mechanisms, which are not mechanical but chemical and deeply unreliable, get disrupted when the attention is suddenly and completely captured. I know this. I read about it. What I couldn't figure out, sitting on that bench, was why the sensible version felt like a translation. Accurate, but missing something, like a map of a place that includes all the correct roads, but leaves out the quality of light at 4 in the afternoon. The specific smell of the air near the canal, the way one corner makes you feel, for no architectural reason, slightly safer than everywhere else. The sensible version said, you experienced awe, your time perception was briefly altered. This is documented and unremarkable. What I'd actually experienced was something more like recognition. And that's the word that scared me a little. Because recognition implies you've encountered the thing before. And I hadn't. I had never in my life seen a royal carriage up close. I'd seen photographs. Everyone had seen photographs. But photographs don't do what that carriage had done, which was pull something out of me that I hadn't known was in there. Not a memory. Not an emotion exactly. Something more like a frequency. As if the thing passing, the horses and the lacquer and the perfect stillness of that figure in green, had vibrated at a pitch that matched something in the center of me. And for 6 or 7 seconds, everything in me had answered. I was 34 years old. I'd grown up in a small town in Yorkshire where the most ceremonial thing that happened annually was the switching on of the Christmas lights, which was done by whichever local celebrity could be talked into it, usually a former footballer or a woman who'd been on a cooking program once. I had no particular feelings about the monarchy. I wasn't royalist, wasn't Republican with any great conviction. It was one of those questions I classified under things that are genuinely complicated, and I'll form a view when I have to. So why did I feel like I'd been tuned? An older man sat down at the other end of my bench. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, with the careful economy of movement that belongs to people who have made peace with their joints. He wore a wax jacket and carried a canvas bag with something heavy in it, books from the shape. He looked at the cold sausage roll on the bench between us with the particular expression of a man who has seen sadder things than an abandoned pastry, but is still registering it as a small tragedy. I picked it up and put it in my bag. "Carriage," he said. I looked at him. "You were up on the mall." It wasn't a question. "I saw you from the top of the steps." "You had that look." "What look?" He considered it. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. "Like something had been explained to you," he said, "that you hadn't realized you'd been asking." I sat with that for a moment. "Is that a common look?" I asked. "Up on the mall." "Common enough." He shifted slightly, resettling his weight. "I've been coming to London every October for 31 years now, since my wife dragged me to the state opening the first time. She was the one who cared about it initially." He paused. "She died in 2019. I'm sorry." "The October trips are still useful," he said. "Different purpose now, but still useful." He didn't explain what the different purpose was, and I didn't ask. There are sentences that are complete even when they're missing their middle. "The carriage," I said. Does it always do that? To people?" He thought about it with the same careful seriousness. "Not always," he said. "Most people take photographs. Most people get the photograph and then look at the photograph and feel they have the thing. But some people," he shrugged, a small, eloquent shrug that covered a lot of ground. "Some people forget to take the photograph. And those are the ones who end up sitting on benches talking to strangers." I laughed. It came out a bit shorter than I'd intended, a bit more honest. "Why does it do that?" I asked. "I'm not royalist. I want to be clear about that. I didn't come here for this." "No," he said, and he didn't sound like he was disagreeing. "You didn't." He looked out at the park. A pair of joggers passed. A man with a pushchair. The usual traffic of a city afternoon. "My grandfather," he said, "was on the mall for the coronation. 1953. He was 19. He'd come down from Carlisle with 3 friends on a coach that broke down twice. They slept on the pavement. He told me once, I must have been 8 or 9, that it wasn't about the Queen. He didn't put it that way, but that's what he meant. He said it was the first time he understood that he'd been alive before he was born. He said it simply, without drama. I understood it immediately, which surprised me. "The continuity," I said. "Something like that." He nodded. "The thing that was there before you, and will be there after. Most of the time you can pretend you're a complete sentence. Your own sentence. Beginning to end, self-contained. And then something like that comes down the road." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the mall. "And it turns out you're a paragraph. Part of something longer." He stood up then, the way old men stand, a negotiation, a gathering of resources, a committed sequence of movements. Picked up his bag of books. "Enjoy the rest of your October," he said. And he walked away into the park, and I never knew his name, and I still think about what he said probably more than I think about most conversations with people I've known for years. I stayed on the bench for a while after. The sky had shifted during the conversation, not committing to rain yet, but making stronger suggestions. The light had that diluted quality that October afternoons in England specialize in, a light that somehow makes everything look both more real and more temporary, as if the world is reminding you that visibility is conditional and not to take it for granted. I thought about my grandfather, who I'd never met. He died before I was born, which gave him the quality of a rumor, a person assembled entirely from other people's accounts, which meant he existed in my mind as a collection of traits rather than a whole. He'd been a miner in County Durham. He'd had large hands and a habit of whistling while he worked. He'd apparently cried at funerals in a way that embarrassed his sons, which I'd always thought was probably the most admirable thing about him. I thought about what it would mean to be alive before you were born. Not mysticism. The man on the bench hadn't meant mysticism. He'd meant lineage. The fact that you arrive in the world pre-threaded into a sequence. You don't begin the thread. You don't end it. You carry it for your section. Most days it's abstract. A fact you know but don't feel. Like knowing you're on a planet that's moving through space, True, completely true, and completely unreal as lived experience. But then a carriage comes down a road, and for 6 or 7 seconds, something that has been moving for a very long time moves past you, and you feel the length of it, and the length of it is also somehow your own. That's time bending, I thought. Not time literally bending. Time becoming dimensional. Depth appearing in something you'd only experienced as flat. The cold found its way through my jacket. I got up. I walked back through the park rather than around it. Past the pelicans, who were exactly as unimpressed with me as they'd been in the morning, which felt correct. Past the saxophone player, who had improved marginally, or possibly I had become more sympathetic. Past the school children, now gone, leaving only a Capri Sun wrapper on the path as evidence. I came out near the palisade and stopped. The Victoria Memorial stood at the top of the mall, the enormous white allegorical figure that anchors the end of that ceremonial avenue. I'd walked past it 4 times in 4 days without really seeing it. The way you stop seeing things you pass regularly, even when you've only been passing them for 4 days. I saw it now. It's an extraordinary object when you actually look at it. Overwhelming in a way that photographs underrepresent. The figures around the base, truth, justice, motherhood, carved into the Portland stone with a confidence that belongs to an era that had not yet learned to be embarrassed about certainty. The gold figure at the very top, victory or fame or something like it, standing above everything with the particular expression of a figure that has been standing above everything for 115 years and has no complaints. I stood there long enough that a tourist asked me what it was. I told her. She took a photograph and moved on. I stood there a little longer. Not photographing, just standing the way the man on the bench had implied some people did, letting the thing be a thing rather than an image of a thing. My phone buzzed. Darren, from Singapore, asking if I'd found the French press in the second cabinet. I had not found the French press. I texted back and walked toward the tube. The thing about London, and this is the part of the story people always want me to skip to the end of, but the middle is the part that matters, is that it doesn't care about your epiphanies. That's one of the things I love about it. You can have a moment of genuine existential realignment on the mall, and then 40 minutes later you're underground in a metal tube with your face 3 inches from a stranger's shoulder bag, and the city is completely indifferent to whatever you've just figured out about yourself, which is, in its way, its own kind of comfort. At Pimlico Station, I bought a pint of milk because I'd forgotten to that morning, and Darren's flat was completely out, and I'd been drinking black tea for 2 days, which was fine, but not sustainable. The man at the till was having an argument with someone on his phone via earbuds while simultaneously scanning my items, and he managed both with the professional competence of a man who has had a lot of practice at parallel irritation. I walked back to the flat. Let myself in with the particular practiced quiet of a man respecting fictional neighbors. Made tea. Sat in the small kitchen with the French press I had now found in the second cabinet. 1 cabinet too late for French press. And looked out at the gray back wall of the building across from Darren's, which had a single window with a green curtain pulled almost but not entirely shut. And I thought about what I'd been asked earlier that week. Before I came to London. Before the cheap flight. And the borrowed key, and the sausage roll. I've been asked by my sister over a phone call I've been dreading, and then not found as bad as I'd expected. What are you actually doing? Not what are you doing in London? What are you doing? Present continuous tense applied to the whole enterprise of my life, which had developed certain load-bearing cracks that I'd been papering over with busyness and the general forward motion of days. I hadn't answered her question. I sat in Darren's kitchen and thought about paragraphs, about being part of something longer than yourself, about a figure in dark green sitting completely still in a moving carriage and the specific quality of that stillness, not absence, not withdrawal, but a presence so committed to itself that it didn't need to reach outward to prove it existed. I thought, that's the thing I keep doing wrong, reaching outward to prove I exist. My tea went cold. I drank it cold the last day. My flight was at 7 in the evening from Heathrow, which gave me the whole morning and early afternoon, and I planned to spend it at the Tate Modern because I hadn't been in years, and I had a specific memory of a room there I wanted to find again, a Mark Rothko room one of the Seagram murals where I'd stood at 22 and felt things I didn't have vocabulary for at 22 and wanted to see if I had vocabulary for now. I did not go to the Tate Modern. I went back to the mall. I won't pretend I'd planned this or that there was any logic to it. I woke up at 7, lay there in the dark of Darren's spare room listening to the sounds of Pimlico beginning its day. A lorry reversing somewhere, a dog, the first tube of the morning making its distant subterranean thunder, and I knew, with the particular certainty of a decision that has made itself, that I was going back. Not because I expected the carriage again. It hadn't been scheduled then, and there was no reason to expect it now. I just needed to stand in that specific piece of London once more before I left it, which tells you something about what Wednesday had done to me. The morning was clearer than Wednesday. A thin, tentative sun had found its way through the cloud and was doing its best with the plane trees on the mall, and they were cooperating, and the result was the kind of light that makes England look, briefly, the way people who have never been to England imagine it always looks. Golden. Generous. More like a memory of itself than an actual place. There were fewer people at this hour. The serious joggers. A tour guide assembling her group near the memorial, counting heads with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has lost members of groups before and has developed systems. 2 children throwing bread at pigeons while their mother told them to stop, in the absent tone of a woman who has fully accepted she will be overruled. I stood roughly where I'd stood on Wednesday. The gravel was the same. The trees. The sky, different but not contradicting. I wasn't expecting anything, and that was different. On Wednesday, I hadn't been expecting anything either, but Wednesday's nothing expected had been the nothing of ignorance. I didn't know to expect anything because I didn't know anything was possible. Today's nothing expected was chosen, was a kind of listening. My friend Priya, who teaches meditation in Edinburgh and is probably the most genuinely settled person I know, talks about this distinction. She calls it the difference between an empty cup and a cupped hand. An empty cup is absence. A cupped hand is receptivity. They look the same. They're completely different. I was trying, standing there in the October sun on the mall, to be a cupped hand. Nothing happened for 20 minutes. I want to be honest about this because I think stories, the kind that get told and retold, the kind I've been telling to people since I got back, have a tendency to cut the boring parts, and the boring parts are where the thing actually lives. 20 minutes of standing on gravel while London went about its business. A pigeon landed near my foot and examined me with one eye and found me uninteresting and left. The tour guide began her tour in a European language I couldn't identify. The 2 bread-throwing children were eventually corralled into a pushchair, one of them making his objections known with a commitment I found quietly admirable. And then something, not a carriage. I want to be clear, I am not about to tell you the carriage came back. This is not that kind of story, and I would not trust that kind of story. What happened was a guard, a single mounted guard, walking his horse along the edge of the mall on his way from somewhere to somewhere else, not part of any formal procession, not performing, just moving through the city the way the city requires. The horse was a bay, brown body, black legs, that particular shade of chestnut brown that horses go when they're young and well cared for. The guard was young too, or seemed it. I couldn't see his face under the helmet, but his posture had the upright tension of someone still learning to be effortless. He was getting there. Another year, and it would look natural. They passed maybe 10 feet from me. The horse's eye caught me for a second. A large, dark eye with a depth that horse eyes have, and human eyes mostly don't. Not because horses are smarter, but because they haven't learned our particular habit of hiding. The eye held me for the time it took the horse to move those 3 or 4 steps, and then it was gone, and the guard was gone, and the particular music of shod hooves on that surface faded into the general sound of the city. I stood there, thought about the eye. Here's what I've been working out in the week since I came home. The thing I came back from London carrying that wasn't in my bag. There are things that have been happening longer than you have. This sounds obvious. It is obvious. You know it the way you know the planet is moving, as a fact that lives in your head without ever quite reaching your body. But occasionally something comes down a road, a carriage, a mounted guard, a horse's eye catching yours for 3 seconds, and the fact becomes physical, become something you can feel in your chest rather than just locate in your memory. The ceremony that produced that carriage has been producing carriages like it for a span of time that makes my individual life look like a footnote to a footnote. The horses that carried the outriders were trained by people who were trained by people who were trained by people in an unbroken chain of knowledge about how a horse's weight shifts at a collected trot, stretching back before my grandfather's grandfather was born. The road they traveled on was laid over a road that was traveled before anyone thought to lay roads. And for 6 or 7 seconds on a Wednesday morning in October, that whole long thing passed close enough to feel. That's what the man on the bench meant, I think, about his grandfather and being alive before you were born. He didn't mean mysticism. He meant you were threaded into duration. You think you're standing outside it watching, but you're always inside it. The carriage just reminds you. The bending of time is not the carriage speeding up or slowing down. The bending of time is the moment you stop experiencing time as a line you're moving along and start experiencing it as a volume you're inside. Front and back in depth. A room rather than a corridor. I was in that room for 6 or 7 seconds. Then I was back in the corridor. But the door was still there. I know how this sounds. I want to address that directly because I'm 34 and I work in financial compliance and I don't have a history of responding to tourist attractions with personal transformation. My colleague James, when I told him some version of this over lunch last month, nodded with the particular patience of a man who is deciding how worried to be about you. It was a nice carriage, he said finally. Yes, I said, that's one version. He accepted this, and we talked about something else. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not trying to convert you to a way of seeing. I'm describing what happened to me on a Wednesday morning when I was between versions of myself, adrift enough to be permeable, present enough to actually receive something, and a very old, very precise, very beautiful thing moved through my field of vision and briefly made the world dimensional in a way it usually isn't. Maybe it only works when you're not looking for it. Maybe it only works when you're in the right kind of empty. I left the mall at 9:30. Walked back through the park for the last time. The pelicans, the saxophone player, a different one today, or the same one improved past the point of recognition. The path along the water with the willows trailing their October hair. I bought a coffee from a cart near the park exit and stood there drinking it in the particular temporary peace of a person who knows they are about to go home and hasn't quite left yet. My sister texted, "Flight still at 7?" Still at 7, I sent back. Then, I think I know what I'm doing. She sent back a question mark. I sent back a thumbs up, which is not an explanation, but sometimes the right response to a question mark is a thumbs up, saying, I will explain later, and later I will have better words, but right now, please trust that something has been answered even if I can't tell you the question. The coffee was good. London always makes better coffee than you expect it to, given its reputation. Something the city keeps mostly to itself. The flight home was unremarkable. That specific unremarkableness of late afternoon flights, where everyone is in the weary phase that comes after the holiday energy has been fully spent and before they've recalibrated a home. The man beside me slept instantly, one of those people who enter the aircraft and immediately leave their body. I read a book, ate the complimentary pretzels, watched the ground below go from the gray complexity of London to the gray complexity of cloud to the gray complexity of Yorkshire. The wheels touched down. I thought, I'm a paragraph, not a sentence. A paragraph inside something much longer, which started before me and will go on after, which has carriages in it and pelicans and old men on benches with canvas bags full of books and horses with eyes like wells, and roads that have been roads for longer than anyone now living can remember. I thought, that's enough. That's actually enough. It's been 4 weeks since October. I've done a few things I've been putting off. I called my sister and had the actual conversation about what I'm doing and what I'm not doing. I signed up for the watercolor class I'd been telling myself for 2 years I was about to sign up for. Neither of these things is dramatic. Neither of these things was caused by a carriage, not directly. But the carriage opened a door, and once a door is open, you can't really pretend it's still closed. I go out sometimes in the early morning, here at home, And I walk along the river path where it runs behind the industrial estate, which is not the mall, not by any measure. And there are no horses and no ceremony. And the most impressive thing that ever passes me is the 7:15 freight train on the viaduct. But I walk differently now. Slower, more vertical, weight distributed like a person who understands they are inside a very long sentence and is trying to carry their claws with some dignity. The train goes past. I can feel, if I pay attention, just at the edge of feeling, the very periphery of it, the length of the thing. How long it's been going, how long it will continue, how briefly and precisely and completely I am here. That's the whole of it. That's what happened. A carriage passed, time bent slightly, and the bend never quite straightened out.